Well, the Human Fertilisation and Embryology Authority is considering a research project by the Francis Crick Institute to disable genes in single-cell human embryos 1 day after fertilisation. Now, after 7 days, the embryos will be destroyed, and the team will examine the effect the gene editing has made. They're trying to understand why the success rate of IVF is so low. Now, it's a pioneering technique which could lead in the long run to more parents having healthy babies through IVF, perhaps, and maybe with a change in the law by implanting embryos whose genes have been altered. Is it right to alter embryos' genes? Dita. Hi, Dita.
Hello.
Dita Wickens Drazilova from the Institute of Medical Ethics. Now, I know we were discussing this earlier on, that you think, and we've got 7 days here, 14 days is the general limit, because 14 days is when the central nervous system begins to develop. And there's some fascinating research and potential research coming out of this. You were saying that you think we should go further and the time limit should be longer.
Possibly, if it's necessary. I don't think for this technique that's
no, but
now...
we're talking, let's talk about general research personally.
Generally, I think it could be argued that we could do research on 3 or 4 week embryos as well. I think there is a bit of strange logic that women can choose to have termination of pregnancy up to week 24, and there doesn't really have to be any reason. While, you know, a 3 or 4 week embryo is very tiny and I would say is not human, doesn't have personality, doesn't have consciousness or suffering, while 24-week-old fetus, you know, that can already survive. There have been babies that survive born at 22, 23 weeks and we're all healthy. I think...
So 18 weeks, something like that?
I'm not sure. I think that would be a wider debate.
Yeah, okay, but there can be, and there would be, you believe, if it were to be longer, more meaningful research, potentially?
Potentially. I'm not sure if anybody's pushing for that, but I think soon it might be. I think what's make and break, whether this is ethical, is that we should remember that people who donate these reproductive tissues, whether it's eggs or whether it's embryos, consent to this properly. They understand, and it's usually surplus tissues that are left over after IVF treatments. So it's not for everybody. I'm not saying, you know, if this is legalized, pushing it to 3 or 4 week embryo research.
But it's perfectly ethical. These are discarded embryos.
I think it is. Some people are against it, and if they are, for example, cannot conceive naturally, they will rather adopt than go for fertility treatment. But those people who go for fertility treatment are often happy to donate their embryos or eggs that are too big or too small that can be used for research. Yeah,
so Professor Callum McCullough, Scottish Council for Human Bioethics. This is, I mean, there are 5 million people on the planet born through IVF, and this gene editing therapy is going to reduce the possibility of miscarriages. The research like this, and also people say and argue, you know, controversially, going to reduce the occurrence of disabilities in babies. I mean, that's a massive issue, but it has huge benefits.
It has huge benefit, but you also have to look at the risks. The first procedure, trying to understand infertility in a better way, is not really something new. They've been doing research on embryos for many years now, and these embryos will be destroyed after 14 days, and this is what is being suggested at the Human Fertilisation Embryology Authority, this application.
That's what you're uncomfortable with, the destroying the embryos?
Of course. Well, we are uncomfortable with it. Let's get something straight first of all. Embryos are piles of cells. Everybody here this morning is a pile of cells. That's all they are from a scientific perspective. Embryos are smaller than a pinhead. Our whole Earth, from a galactic perspective, is even smaller than a pinhead. The only reason why we believe here this morning that we have any value and worth is because of beliefs. Now, up to 1/3 of people in Scotland, I don't know how it is in the whole of the UK, believe, and it is a belief, it's not a scientific proof, but they believe that embryos are like children. And therefore what you're doing is, and I'm sorry about the language, you're sacrificing children for biomedical research.
Chris Gingell.
So we have to put this in the context of the world we live in that
respond to those points. Sacrificing children.
So it's very controversial whether they would be children. If they are children, we've got a very massive worldwide problem in that most embryos that are created are destroyed by natural processes. It's about 200 million embryos every year by some estimates are destroyed by natural processes. So that means natural embryo loss is the greatest cause of human death worldwide, if you think they're like children. Now, surely you think we should be doing all we can to reduce those hundreds of millions of deaths worldwide, including by doing some research, like has been proposed at the Francis Crick Institute, to understand human development and to understand rates of miscarriage and to reduce them.
Can I respond? Well, first of all, of course, we're all going to die, and a lot of us are going to die from natural causes. But to come back to ethics, ethics is about trying to decide what to do or what not to do. And that is why we are looking at this issue right now. We're trying to decide whether or not we destroy embryos or we try to do other kind of research. And I'm not opposed to all kind of research on embryos as long as it is for the benefit of the embryos.
And an embryo should never be discarded and destroyed. You think that's beyond the ethical pale for
Exactly, and that's what the whole of Germany believes. We're not only the only ones like this. The whole German government and the German law says embryos should not be destroyed.
There are interesting historical reasons
It's
for that.
also, you're against a lot of forms of contraception then too. We know that one of the mechanisms through which the pill works, it does stop ovulation, but it also increases the rate of miscarriage because the embryo can't attach the uterine wall. Other forms of contraception also work through that method. So if you've got that belief, you're also against some forms of contraception.
I'm not opposed to contraception.
Let's move it to Chris McLaughlin. Catholic voices. I hear Catholic voices screaming to my right. Go on.
Well, you know, the intention here is to promote, to deal with infertility. And there's nothing the Catholic Church wants more than people who want babies having babies. It's a great idea. So it's a noble endeavour and it's well-intentioned.
What about population? What about, have we not got too many people on the planet already?
Well, they say it will level out in about 2060 because the birth rate worldwide is only about replacement level. But, however, the problem here, it's not what we're trying to achieve, which is to solve infertility. It's a mechanism of how we get there. And embryos are human beings. They are human beings who in a different environment would become children, would become adults, would grow old, just like everyone else here. And their dignity and the respect which is commanded by their dignity comes from their creation in the image and likeness of God, like everyone else here.
Dita, do you want to come back on that?
Let's take it point at a time.
Yeah, let's take it point at a time. Embryos are human beings. Dita.
Well, I don't think they are, but you know, it's a big ethical and philosophical question. When does human life actually start? And a lot of people believe that it starts at the moment of conception. Other people, it's much later. Actually, legally, you know, a fetus doesn't have human rights until it's born. So, you know, I don't think we will agree. Nobody will ever agree. But it's, as I said, it's on individual people's choices. If researchers don't want to get involved in embryo research, they don't have to. If patients don't want to get referred to fertility clinic, they don't have to. In this country, nobody's forced to donate eggs or embryos.
Point there? This isn't an entirely self-regarding action. If we edit the human genome, that affects all human beings which will be born for all of time, for all of human history. Now, how happy would we be in this room if 200 years ago the scientists of the 1700s and 1800s had decided which human genes should be passed on to the generation? What would that have meant for gay people, black people, disabled people, women, many others?
Rob Lyons, you're looking quizzical.
Your decisions are going to have effects for all time.
What often underpins these debates about embryo research is a fear of bad faith, that actually underneath it all, people are doing these things for some monstrous reason. And actually, we have to recognise, actually, that all the reasons for this are good ones. It's about increasing human life. It's about avoiding of suffering. And I think in that respect, I think that this research is incredibly valuable.
Can I suggest that a lot of medical research
Donald,
that's done is actually very speculative. I work a lot on medical ethics questions, and one of the big problems is that the hopes that you have in the laboratory turn out not to be fulfillable finally. And with the case of editing the germline, actually editing the embryo's genes, you've got a problem.
Isn't that the nature of science, trial and error?
Exactly. Well, the trial and error in this case...
You can't always have experiments that are going to work.
If the problem is here, the experimental subjects are babies, because you'd have to make these interventions in embryos, test several of the embryos, take them to term, find out what happens. You can't treat babies as experimental
Embryos
objects.
are babies.
No, you would have to take the embryo to term. If you were going to manipulate the human germline, these would have to become actual children. You would have to have experimented on them. That is ethically way unacceptable.
But we don't need to take...
So the problem is... can I finish? The problem is that the idea of intervening in the human germline is always going to be too risky because you're never going to be able to do that experiment ethically. Therefore, you can only do this sort of research for reasons to understand rather than for final therapy using the editing technique.
Audience thoughts when you can, Chris?
So, two things. So, the first thing is that we don't have to bring these embryos to term. We're talking about very basic research here. We don't even know how these technologies will behave in human cells. What we're saying is let's do some research because there are widespread opportunities to develop, to understand human development, and also to develop non-genetic engineering-based treatments for other types of diseases. Now, a second thing about the human germline. Now, it's just this myth that we alter the germline all the time. Every one of us has random mutations that have altered the germline every time we have a child. When we know now that older fathers have a greater rate of random germline mutations, the germline's been altered all the time. It's not like some risky thing.
But if you're doing experiments, it's different.
Is there any aspect of this that if it fell into unethical hands, this type of biotechnology, can you see any aspect?
Of course, we need to be very, very careful. I
Yeah.
don't want to say we should just be willy-nilly, let's do anything. We need to be very, very careful. We need to carefully understand the types of genes that we're thinking about alter. We need to carefully consider the values that we're going to use when we make those alterations. But I think if we're guided by trying to relieve suffering caused by genetic disease, then that is a great opportunity which we should pursue.
That's the guiding light, suffering. Professor, I've been seeing, Mike, if I may, I've been seeing a range of interesting facial expressions so far throughout.
My facial expressions?
Yes.
Well, I'm with Dieter on this. I cannot envisage how the pile of cells can be considered to have an entity as a baby or as a child. And, you know, as we've heard, the whole process of research on infertility engages with the collection of large numbers of cells which are going to be disposed of anyway. And if you can do something useful with those cells, then I think this is moving things forward.
When does it become human?
The idea that people are going to then use some sort of ghastly idea, you're going to program people so they would never be gay or never be anything but Catholic is kind of bizarre.
You say you can't envisage how a pile of cells can be a human being. Yeah. I've got 4 children at home who are all IVF children. And one of them I saw as 5 cells pulsing in a Petri dish. That rather reinforces the feeling that they can be, actually. And I don't come at this from any particular perspective. I'm not anti-abortion. While we were having IVF, we were trying to work out where to put our feet. And in that process, we conceived triplets. And then you have this conversation, a rather chilling conversation that happens with the clinic, where the doctor says, we can offer you reduction. So what he's offering you there is the reduction of one of the embryos in order to increase the possibilities of the others being healthy and coming to life, which is fine. But,
so reduction is killing of one of the embryos, discarding, destruction. Killing is a loaded term, but you know what I mean.
Yeah, I wouldn't necessarily use that term. I'm feeling my way into this.
Sure.
But when I go home tonight and sit down for dinner with those 3 children, in particular the triplets, you know, I'm thinking, well, which one of those would it have been?
I don't think the reduction happens at the stage we're talking about here. And I think
it was at 8 weeks.
Yeah,
was at 8
weeks. The cells that you saw in a Petri dish pulsing, as you seem to think they were, I'm not sure if they really were pulsing, but anyway, there would have been lots of other cells that didn't get into the Petri dish, and we just throw them away. So, I mean, I think that's sad.
Nicky?
I want to say that from an ethical standpoint, I don't want to see us in the position where we're kind of creating a kind of stormtrooper style of conception, yes. But also I would like, we learn a lot as human beings from imperfection. I think there's a lot to be learned by society, and families, I'm sure, would say that by imperfection they learn a lot about themselves and also about the world.
Yeah, yeah. Good morning.
Good morning.
Yeah.
I think
quick points.
There's perhaps even a bigger question in the sense that it's not just about manipulating those cells and playing with genes. It's looking at the long-term effect on that person who will grow into a human, as it were. For a number of reasons, I guess, and I don't know what the technical medical reasons are. I was born deaf in one ear. I've got tight limbs and muscles in my legs, so I limp a bit. It's always made me different. And as I've grown up, I've had to live with that. Now, if it had been possible to correct these things, I would have grown up differently. and I wouldn't have seen people reacting to me in a certain way, and I wouldn't have reacted to them in a certain way. So it's actually playing with my whole psyche and my whole worldview.
I think this is very important. And Callum,
Yes.
That's what makes you, isn't it?
Yes,
Yeah.
absolutely.
The tolerance, do you think this will lead down the road to an intolerance of... we're all imperfect, but an intolerance of, physical imperfection or whatever, however it's seen?
Yes, well, it depends when you do the gene therapy or the gene editing, let's say. If the person already exists and you bring about a therapy that will change the person's genes, that would be acceptable already. I mean, it's been considered by international law and so on. Even in radiotherapy or in chemotherapy, you're already changing the genes of a person. And it could also sometimes be germline. That means all their descendants will also have this genetic modification. But what you're there doing is trying to treat this person or even save the life of the person. However, if you do the gene editing, the gene transformation in the creating process, what you're doing is creating a different person. So my neighbour here would not exist. It would be another person who is perfect or who's got a good hearing system and so on. And what you're then saying is that the person behind me should not have existed, but another person should have existed. And when society starts to say certain people should exist and other people should not exist, you're starting a eugenic process.
But isn't that the lottery of conception?
Yes.
Isn't the lottery of conception?
It is a lottery of conception, but it's
let Chris back on that in the time
I
we've
don't
got.
think it's ridiculous to say that if you change the gene at one point in development, so you weren't deaf, say, you'd be one person. But if you change the disease at day one when they're born and you said, oh, we've got this injection we can give you which cures your deafness, you'd be a completely different person. They're equivalent to me. You just make the change.
They're not. From a philosophical perspective and existential perspective,
No, from a philosophical
I've been to whole
sense, they
conferences on this. They are not equivalent.
How
You're
is
creating
changing
two
one gene
different persons.
change-
And that is why the problem is. You cannot say that two different persons are unequal. They have exactly the same value.
So one
the same
implication of Callum's view, so we know when mothers drink during pregnancy, we think this is a very harmful thing to do, and we know that causes genetic mutations in the child. What Callum is saying is that you're not harming a baby when you drink during pregnancy. You're creating a new baby. You're changing the individual baby.
I'm not saying that
We
at all.
think mothers should be harmed.
I'm not saying that at all. I don't think you understand the philosophical conundrum. When you have a baby already, or even in a fetus, what you're doing is treating the baby. You're not saying this baby should not exist. But in the creative process of fertilization, what you are doing is saying this person should not exist.
Professor Lean, is there a danger here we are creating, because you hear all these phrases, your time-worn phrases, slippery slope, eugenics, perfect babies. Do you think there's any danger of that whatsoever and creating an intolerance?
I think there are always slippery slopes, but heavens above, there's plenty of people keeping a very close eye on those slippery slopes. And I don't
Do we trust those people?
The brave new world that exists down the bottom of the slippery slope is somewhere we'll never get to. I mean, we see, as a doctor, I see people who have not a little bit of deafness and a little bit of a limp, but really serious problems which commit them to long-time, lifelong care, which potentially could have been corrected by a small genetic alteration at a very early stage.
But they wouldn't be the same people.
Yeah, they wouldn't be the same people. They would be people who are more like us, and they don't require...
More like us?
Well, there is... That's unfortunate expression. If you have been seen babies who are born who will remain at the mental age of 1 for the entirety of their lives, that is not a good state to be in. And we would like them to be able to enjoy life as we do, and I would like that. And I think that if you can do something simple, and it isn't going to be with every case, but if there is something simple that you can do with a genetic tweak at a very, very early stage to give that person the potential to have a more fulfilling life, I think there's nothing wrong with that. The problem is, and I see where Callum's coming from, you've got to do the research to find out how to do it. And you can't do that with a study that goes on for the first 14 days.
We are going to have to leave that very interesting debate on that particular very interesting point. Thank you all very much indeed. Thank you for that.